White man adopts 4 black girls, thinking he is giving them a new life. His friends laughed at him, not knowing that years later they would be jealous of his life. How did this family defy the odds? And what makes their journey so special? Before we get into the story, kindly comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Paul stood at the window of his small flat and watched the sky turn soft pink and orange as the sun rose. His old medical book was sitting on a shelf nearby, gathering dust, but never being forgotten. He reached out and touched one of them, running his fingers along the spine of Gray's Anatomy. Even though it had been 3 years, he could still remember his last day of medical school like it was yesterday. It was easy for him to picture himself crying as he told the dean that he couldn't pay for the last year's fees. He had no more funds, and no bank would give him another loan. Sometimes life has other plans for us, he said to himself in a whisper. Miss Martha, who used to take care of him at the school, used to tell him this. Paul went to his small kitchen and brewed his coffee. As he waited for it to finish, the room filled with the rich smell of coffee. He looked at the old picture on his fridge. It was of him, when he was 7 years old, standing in front of the Hope Haven shelter, with Miss Martha's arm around his shoulders. He remembers that day very well. It had been 2 weeks since his parents had left him there, saying they would come back, but never did. To make him feel better, Miss Martha helped him plant a small garden. That one act of kindness changed his whole life. Paul got ready for work while taking a sip of his coffee. As he put his social worker ID card in his pocket in the morning light, it caught the light. His dream job was to be a doctor, but he had found another way to heal people, not their bodies, but their hearts and souls. It only took 6 blocks to get to Hope Haven through a quiet area. Paul took a deep breath of the fresh morning air as he walked along in a rhythmic way. As the old brick building with busy windows in the early morning became clear, it was easy to see. The playground was filled with the sound of kids laughing. Stephen took a moment to look up at the place that had shaped his life, before going up the old stone steps. The ivy-covered walls held a lot of memories, some good and some bad. This is where he learned that family wasn't always about blood relatives. Sometimes it was about the people who loved you even after other people had left. Tommy, one of the younger kids, waved in a crazy way from behind the fence and said, "Good morning, Mr. Miller." Paul smiled and waved back. The honest happiness on the boy's face warmed his heart. That's why he kept coming back. This was how he gave the gift of hope that he had received here. The other way. He walked up the stairs and took out his keys, ready to start a new day at the place he now called home, but not as a resident. Instead, he would be there as someone who could help kids, just like others had helped him. Paul's day went at the normal steady pace inside Hope Haven. He helped serve breakfast to the kids, watched over their morning exercises, and did paperwork in the small office he shared with 2 other social workers. Bright splashes of chalk and paint from kids' art were all over the walls, making the small room feel cozier. A handmade "World's Best Social Worker" card, which was a little wonky but full of love, hung proudly next to his desk. Margaret, who runs the adoption center, knocked on his door around noon. Paul had to sit up straighter in his chair because her face showed that she was worried. The dark bags under her eyes showed that she hadn't been able to sleep because of her problems. Her voice was tense with worry as she asked, "Paul, do you have a moment?" He pointed to the chair across from his desk and said, "Yes. Of course. What's on your mind?" Margaret sat down deeply and held a folder close to her chest, as if it held sad news. "It's about the 4 babies we got last month. They're pretty and healthy 12-year-old girls," she said, pausing to look down at the folder and tapping it uncomfortably. "Just this week, 12 couples have come through. They all picked out other kids." Paul rubbed his brow. "What do you mean?" She spoke softly, her voice shaking a little. "The white kids are being adopted quickly. But these 4 little girls are black, and no one comes to ask about them. When some couples found out we only had black kids, they went elsewhere. She used the back of her hand to wipe her eyes, which slightly smudged her makeup. I do not know what to do. They need a safe place to live as much as any other child. Paul could feel a familiar pain in his chest getting tighter. He knew what it was like to be passed over, to be thought of as less deserving of love and family. He felt very sad when he thought about how he felt as a child watching other kids leave for their new homes. He asked in a soft voice, "Can I see them?" He was led to the nursery area by Mrs. Margaret Thompson, who nodded. It was a calm room with soft yellow and green walls, and a small radio in the corner playing soft classical music. In the corner, there were 4 similar cribs set up in a half circle. Above each one, a handmade mobile was slowly spinning. Paul walked up slowly, and his heart started to beat faster. 4 faces that were exactly the same looked up at him. They were very small and perfect, with brown eyes and soft features. He smiled at one of the babies, whose gums were pink. Someone else reached up with very small fingers. The third one softly cooed, and the fourth one looked at him with smart, curious eyes. His heart melted right away. These weren't just cases or numbers. They were 4 beautiful lives that were full of hope and deserve all the love in the world. Paul felt something change inside him as he stood there and looked at their innocent faces. He still couldn't put his finger on what it was. He knew deep down that this moment would change everything though. "Margaret," Paul told Mrs. Thompson, with a firm tone in his voice, "I promise you that we'll find these girls the perfect family. That chance should be given to every child." He firmly gripped the edge of his desk with his hands, making his fingers white with anger. Margaret's eyes got soft with hope, and she adjusted her cardigan, which was something she did all the time while she was at the school for 15 years. "Andy, I know that you are the one who can help. You have always been able to see the beauty in every child." After work that day, Paul walked to the downtown small clothes store. As he walked in, the bell above the door rang. His social worker pay barely met his basic needs, so his wallet felt light. But he knew exactly how he wanted to spend his savings. He found what he was looking for inside the store, past the racks of children's clothes. It was 4 identical blue dresses that were light and pretty, with small white flowers sewn around the collars. He loved how the soft cotton fabric felt against his fingers. The shop owner, an old woman with kind eyes, carefully wrapped each dress in tissue paper while Paul tallied the money. He had saved almost half of that amount every month, but seeing those dresses made him happy. This month, he would skip a few lunches, but it would be worth it. Back at the home, Miss Margaret helped each girl put on her new blue dress. She did this by gently guiding little arms through the sleeves and buttoning the backs of the dresses. Their dark skin shone against the soft blue cloth, making them look like little angels. Their eyes were bright with interest. "There you go," Paul said, carefully fixing the last small collar. "Now, when families come to visit, you'll give them your biggest smiles, won't you?" Next morning, it was clear and bright, and golden light came in through the windows of the adoption center. Paul carefully helped the 4 kids get ready by smoothing out their blue dresses that matched and putting bright ribbons in their dark, curly hair. He made sure that each bow was tied correctly and that the satin strips were even and neat. He was determined that they all looked their best. The girls stood next to the adoption center's front door with their little hands clasped together. They looked so innocent and hopeful that Paul's heart swelled with love. "Remember what we practiced?" Paul got down on his knees next to them and carefully straightened out a ribbon that was a little off-center. "Okay, big smiles, just be yourself." The first couple got there right on time, at 9:15. They looked nice. The woman wore an expensive flower dress and a pearl necklace, and the man wore khakis that were ironed and a blue button-down shirt. Paul felt cautious hope rise in his heart as the girls said, "Good morning," in their practiced greeting, perfectly harmonized voices. But the couple barely looked at them. Their faces were blank and indifferent. The woman's eyes skipped over them like they weren't there. The man put his hand on his wife's back and led her to a different part of the center, where a little girl with fair hair played with wooden blocks. Paul felt the pain of rejection so strongly that it was like it were coming from a person. It made his chest tighten with familiar pain. During the long morning, the scene kept happening over and over. Couple after couple came through the heavy wooden doors. And every time, the girls were brave enough to meet them with joy and hope. Every time, they got strange looks, shuffled their feet, or seemed to not care at all. By noon, their little shoulders were sagging and their smiles, which used to be bright, were getting dull, like stars going out. Paul saw them work so hard, and each time they were turned down, it broke his heart a little more. When there were no guests around and it was quiet, he sneaked off to the kitchen and came back with a special treat. A plate of warm chocolate chip cookies that smelled great and small cups of cold milk. He softly called out, "Come here, sweethearts," and led them to their favorite spot with the soft pillows and worn-out stuffed animals. As they sat down in a tight circle around him, he gave them the still warm cookies. He was very proud and said, "You did so well today. I'm very proud of you all." One of the girls spoke to him. She had big brown eyes and cookie bits on her chin. "Nobody wants us," she said softly, her voice shaking a little. Paul used a paper napkin to gently wipe her chin. His touch was soft and comforting. His voice was smooth and warm, and he said, "People don't always know what they're missing. But that's okay, we'll try again tomorrow. In life, the best things take time and extra love." Sometimes, they had a break, and he spent the rest of it making them laugh, with silly faces and funny stories about his own childhood. With relief, he watched as the sadness in their eyes slowly went away. Once the girls were done with their cookies and milk, he gave each of them a soft, protective hug. "Ready to try again tomorrow?" he asked. They proudly nodded, feeling better because of his words of support, the sweets, and the love that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Paul watched the next morning from his old wood desk as the four kids sat down by the door as usual. They were wearing clean, pressed blue dresses and had their hair carefully braided into patterns that matched. He felt a mix of hope and worry in his heart as he looked at their brave faces, and noticed that they stood a little straighter today. The first couple of the day walked in. They were young, holding hands, and their matched wedding bands sparkled in the sun. It was clear and sweet to hear the girls say, "Good morning." But the couple looked right past the girls as if they were wallpaper, straight at a blonde baby playing with wooden blocks in the corner. This is something that many people have done before them. The same thing happened every day, and it was wearing them down little by little. Paul would help the girls get ready every morning by straightening their dresses and making sure their bows were in place while giving them kind words. They stood by the door every day, their little faces full of hope, and their hands clasped together to stay strong. Every day, that hope would slowly fade like the mist in the morning. As family after family walked by without a word, Paul did everything he could to cheer them up, because his heart hurt for them. He would bring them homemade chocolate chip cookies, or tell them stories about brave queens who never gave up. "Sometimes the best things take time," he would say, but he could see how much it hurt. With each refusal, their smiles got a little forced, their shoulders got a little hunched, and their eyes got a little less bright. After seeing yet another couple walk by without noticing this time, barely trying to hide their blank looks in the third day, one of the girls, the smallest of the four, turned to Paul with tears in her dark eyes. "Mr. Paul," she whispered, her small hands curled into fists, and her lower lip shaking. "Will we ever be good enough?" She broke down in tears and ran down the hall, her patent leather shoes clicking on the floor as she went. Her sisters just stood there and looked at her hopelessly. They both had worried looks on their faces. As Paul started to follow her, his heart broke. His eyes hurt from crying too much. A deep voice spoke from behind him all of a sudden. It said, "Excuse me," which made Paul turn around. A tall man in a clean business suit stood there. He looked kind but determined, and the edges of his eyes were wrinkled with age. "I saw 4 quadruplets here, and I want to adopt them," he told me. Andy turned around to face the voice. He looked into the eyes of a well-dressed man in his 50s. The man had silver streaks in his hair that was nicely combed, and his well-fitted suit made him look successful and stable. The man put out his hand and said, "My name is Matthew Jenkins. I own several restaurants in the area, and I couldn't help but notice these wonderful girls over the past few days." Paul shook his hand, and he felt hope grow in his heart. He agreed, his voice heavy with feeling. "The girls are great. They're incredibly sweet and bright." Mr. Jenkins nodded, and the edges of his eyes wrinkled. "I've been looking to expand my family, and when I saw them," he seemed to pause and gather his thoughts. "Well, believe I could give them the life. They deserve a good education, loving home, everything they need to thrive." While Margaret quickly went to get their sister, who had run away, the 3 girls who stayed by the door watched with wide eyes. When all 4 girls were together, Mr. Jenkins got down on his knees. He said in a soft voice, "Hello, girls. Would you like to live with me? My house is big and has a lovely yard where you can play." The girls looked at each other, and their faces changed from doubt to wary excitement. The little one, who had been crying, took a step forward. In a small voice, she asked, "Really? Really, Mr. Jenkins said, with a small smile. That night, Margaret took care of the paperwork quickly and easily. Her trained hands went through the papers quickly, while Mr. Jenkins signed each page. Paul was both happy and sad as he watched the process. The girls would finally have a place to live, which made his heart both happy and sad. As Mr. Jenkins got ready to leave with the girls, each bringing a small bag of things, the girls turned to Paul one by one and gave him a tight hug. Their blue dresses rustled as they moved. They all said, "Thank you, Mr. Paul," with hopeful looks on their faces. Paul watched as they left with Mr. Jenkins's big hands holding their small ones. Their blue dresses swayed as they walked. They turned around one last time to say goodbye, and Paul waved back with a happy heart. He had done it. They had found a family through him, someone who would love and care for them. After a few days, Paul was holding his phone while sitting at his desk at the shelter. 5 failed tries to reach Mr. Jenkins in the last few days were shown on the screen. Those talks had always been short and unsatisfying, leaving him with more questions than solutions. Yesterday, Mr. Jenkins said, "Oh, they're fine, just getting used to it." His voice sounded strangely far away and short. "Too busy to talk now. You understand how it is with new children." There was a familiar feeling in Paul's gut that had kept him up for the past few nights. He had spent enough time with those girls to know their little habits and routines. Like how they'd beg for 5 more minutes of story time before bed. They loved to talk about everything about their day, from what they ate for breakfast, to which clouds looked like bunnies. Something was off about the quiet, like a song that wasn't in tune. Paul got up from his desk and walked down the hall to Margaret's office. He ran his hands through his messy hair. As he knocked on her door, the sound of his steps bounced off the floorboards, and the rhythm of each sound matched the beat of his racing heart. "Come in," Margaret said, in her usual soft, warm voice. Paul walked in and fidgeted with his sleeve, which was a habit he picked up when he was an orphan. His voice was tinged with worry as he said, "Margaret, I can't shake this feeling about the girls. I don't feel good. It makes me feel like an alarm is going off in my head." Margaret looked up from her work. Behind her reading glasses, her kind eyes were twitching with worry. Paul paced the small office and asked, "What do you mean?" "Mr. Jenkins barely answers my calls," he replied. "When he does, he hangs up the phone quickly, as if he couldn't wait to end the call. There are no sounds of the girls at all. Paul walked faster, leaving a mark on the carpet that you couldn't see. I know I should be happy they found a home, but something feels off. Margaret put down her pen and gave him a soft look. Andy, adopted parents often need some time to get to know their new kids. Mr. Jenkins might just want to help them get settled in. Don't forget how hard it can be in the beginning. Paul just nodded, but the stress of his fear stayed in his shoulders. I think you're right. I really care about those girls a lot. They deserve everything. I know you do, Margaret said, with a warm smile that made her face look softer. That is what makes you unique, Paul. Don't worry too much, though. Allow them time to get used to it. But Paul felt more uneasy as he walked back to his desk. It was like a shade getting longer in the afternoon sun. He chose what to do by taking his jacket off the coat rack. The man in question ran a restaurant in town. To ease his mind, he might want to stop by and see what's going on. He had to look at them, hear them laugh, and see that they were truly happy. He tried to sound relaxed as he walked by Margaret's office and said, "I'm going into town for a bit." Paul stepped outside into the cool fall air, and the leaves crunched under his feet. He took deliberate steps as he walked toward the bus stop. He had to figure out if his gut was telling him the truth, or if he was just being too guarded. He wouldn't stop until he knew those girls were really okay and safe in their new home. He was right in front of Mr. Jenkins's diner an hour later. Paul sat down in a corner booth at Jenkins' family restaurant and tapped nervously on the printed menu. Even though it was the middle of the week, the place was noisy with people talking and dishes clattering. He ordered a simple bowl of soup because he was here for a bigger reason than to eat. When he saw her, his heart almost stopped. One of the 4 babies, Sarah, walked up to his table with a tray that looked too heavy for her small frame. Her eyes, which used to be bright, were tired, and she quickly pulled her hair back. He gave her a blue dress, but she wore an apron that was dirty over old clothes that were too big for her. "Sarah?" he asked in a low voice. The girl's eyes lit up when she saw the girl, and she almost dropped the tray. She muttered, "Mr. Paul," but you could barely hear her. She put his soup down with shaking hands. She quickly looked back over her shoulder at the kitchen with worry. "Are you okay? Is your sister not with you?" Paul put his chin on the table and spoke softly. "Sarah, what's going on?" Her bottom lip shook. "Everyone works here. Rachel and Lucy have dishes to do. Emma is cleaning the back." She pulled her hands up into her apron. "We have to work all day for Mr. Jenkins. We haven't played since we got here. We are so worn out, Mr. Paul." Andy's anger grew like a tide in his chest. He saw Mr. Jenkins come out of the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up and a smile on his face as he looked out over his busy restaurant. When Paul stood up, his chair hit the floor. He yelled, "Mr. Jenkins." His voice was calm even though he was mad. "We need to talk now." Jenkins walked up with a fake smile on his face. What path did Paul take to get here? "Why do you treat these girls this way?" Paul asked, pointing to Sarah, who had leaned back against a nearby table. "They're children, not servants." Jenkins's smile went away. He said in a cold voice, "They're earning their keep. What did you think? That I'd feed and dress for kids just because I cared? That's exactly what adoption means." A lot of people at close tables turned to hear Paul's voice. Jenkins scoffed. "Wow, you're not as smart as I thought. I needed help running this place, but it costs too much to hire real workers. These girls are being given a place to stay and food. They should be thankful." He took out his phone with a shaking hand. "You're taking advantage of kids. I'm calling the police right now." He was already calling, and his eyes never left Jenkins's face. As he told the police about the child labor violation, Sarah watched from close by, and her tired eyes started to light up with hope. As 3 patrol cars pulled up in front of Jenkins' family restaurant. In the early afternoon, the sound of their sirens filled the air. The red and blue lights of the cars reflected off the shop windows. People stopped eating in the middle of a bite to look with wide eyes. As officers in dress walked into the business. As they got closer, Mr. Jenkins' face turned as pale as a ghost. As they read him his rights and put handcuffs on his shaking arms, he lost his normally cocky attitude. One officer told Jenkins firmly, "Child labor is a serious offense, sir," as he walked him to the door. His badge sparkled in the spotlight. "You'll have plenty of time at the station to explain yourself. We have proof of more than one violation." The other 3 girls slowly came out of the back kitchen. As they squished together with Sarah, their little shoes squeaked on the tile floor. Their aprons still had flour on them, and their small bodies moved like leaves in the wind. Paul's heart hurt very much when he saw how scared they looked. He lowered himself to their level and spread his arms wide. "It's okay now," he said softly. "Don't worry, you will never have to work like that again. I promise." Emma, who was the youngest by a few minutes, started crying and ran into his arms. Her little body shook as she cried. Soon, her sisters came running after her, and Paul was holding all 4 of them, while they cried, and their tears got wet on his shirt. As Mary sobbed in short, hiccuping fits, we thought maybe that was just how it was supposed to be. Her voice was weak and unclear, that maybe we had to earn the right to be loved. Paul had to blink back tears as his throat got tight with emotion. "Not now, sweethearts. You don't have to work for love. You deserve it just for being yourself. You're valuable just the way you are." There was a female cop who came up to us slowly and with kind eyes. "We need to take them back to the kids' home now. There are things we need everyone to say, but they can wait until tomorrow. Today has been hard enough for them." Little Lucy pulled frantically on Paul's sleeve as they walked toward the waiting police car. She had a firm grip on the fabric. "Will you come with us? We're scared." "Of course, I will," Paul said, his voice heavy with thought and feeling. One by one, he helped them get into the back seat of the police car. He felt guilty and bad about what he did. He should have gone with his gut more often. He ought to have checked on them sooner. He should have been able to see through the act. The warning signs were there the whole time. Jenkins's adoption seemed too quick. He dodged questions about the girls' training, and he was too smooth and charmed. There was only the soft hum of the engine and the girls' sniffles to break up the quiet ride back to the home. Paul took their little hands in his, and promised himself that he would find a way to make things right. These sweet kids deserved so much better than what they had been through, and he was determined that they would never have to deal with such cruelty again. When they got back to the home, Margaret took Paul aside while the girls got settled in their old room. Because of what happened at the restaurant, their blue dresses were now wrinkly and dirty. Long shadows were cast by the late afternoon sun through the hallway windows, which made the mood even worse. "Paul," Margaret said, in a soft voice. Her eyes were sad, and her worn-out hands were twitching with anxious energy. "We both understand why this keeps happening. Because of the color of their skin, these pretty girls are being used, hurt, and passed over. They are facing a terrible truth far too soon. Too many times have I seen it happen." Paul was hit hard by the truth of what she said. He put his hand on the wall to steady himself, because the hard truth was making his shoulders slump. It wasn't an accident that they were turned down, looked at sideways, and had parents rush past them. It was just bias, nothing else. He felt sick to his stomach when he realized it. He went into the girls' room and saw them huddled together on one of the small beds. Their matched blue dresses were a sea of rumpled blue fabric. They looked up at him with faith so great that it hurt his heart. Their eyes were still red from crying. As they cried, a toy bear that they had forgotten about lay on the floor. He held out his arms and said, "Come here." They ran to him right away and almost knocked him off balance. He pulled them close to him while fighting back tears. The smell of their shampoo and the saltiness of their tears mixed together. He said, with a powerful voice, "Listen to me, all of you. Just the way you are, you're perfect. Your hearts and faces are beautiful. There's nothing wrong with you at all. People who are prejudiced against you and can't see how great you are the problem. Don't let other people change your mind. Sarah hid her face in his shirt and grabbed the fabric with her little fingers. Why don't they want us? Because they're blind, Paul said, as he squeezed them tighter. He could feel their hearts beating in his chest. It's impossible for them to see how kind, strong, and happy you are. I see you, though. I can see how unique each of you is. I see how you laugh and help each other. You're so brave. When they clung to him and cried, their little bodies shook. Paul's heart changed. He felt more than just sympathy for these girls. It was a deeper, more profound love. That was the kind of love that made him want to do anything to make the world a better place for them. He thought about how to keep them safe from life's bad things all night. Because of this kind of love, he realized that maybe he had been blind too, because he hadn't seen what was right in front of him the whole time. He wanted to help these kids, not just any kids. They were his kids. The thought scared him and pumped him up at the same time. Could he really give these girls the home they needed since he was single and didn't have much money? As he held them close, the question kept going through his mind. He knew that the most important solutions come from the heart, not the head. Paul sat at his small kitchen table that night in his simple one-bedroom apartment. A broken desk lamp was the only source of light in the room. It cast long shadows across the space. He had forgotten about his coffee because his mind was so busy with thoughts of hope and fear. A few framed pictures from his time at the orphanage decorated the walls. They seemed to watch him in silence as he thought about the most important choice of his life. In the quiet room, the clicking of the wall clock could be heard, marking each moment of his thought. He thought to himself, could I really be their father? As he ran his fingers through his hair, his hands were shaking a little. He looked at his open bank account and saw that the numbers were smaller than ever, which made him feel like his dreams were not real. His pay as a social worker wasn't very much, just enough to cover his basic needs. To raise 4 girls, you would have to make the most of every dollar. He would have to work extra hours or maybe even look for other work. He took a quick look around his room. It would have to be changed in every way. The girls' bedroom would have to be turned into the small living room, with bunk beds crammed into every area. He had to sleep on the old, lumpy couch. They would need to buy clothes, school materials, food, and medical care. The list seemed to go on forever, and it kept getting longer as time went on. He remembered how lonely it was to see other kids leave for their new homes. How painful it was to wonder why no one picked him. And how his heart would jump with hope every time potential parents came to visit. He thought back to the promise he made to himself. If he ever got the chance, he would make sure no child felt that way. He had lived his whole life by that promise, which led him to work as a social worker. They deserve so much more than this, Paul said to himself. As he looked around at the worn rugs, used furniture, and small rooms, he then thought of their faces, how they trusted him, and how strong they were, despite everything they had been through. He thought about how they were kind to each other, and how they shared everything without being upset. They didn't need fancy things. All they wanted was love, safety, and someone who would always stand by them. He saw an old picture of himself at the home as a child, standing by himself at a Christmas party. The sad look in that boy's eyes told a story of years of heartbreak and longing. He gently touched the frame, feeling the cool glass between his fingers as he picked it up. They won't have to feel that way, he said, with more force. Not if I can help it. The fears were still there, the problems with money, the difficulties of being a single dad, and the huge duty of raising 4 kids. Even though each worry was big, they all seemed less important now. His heart knew what to do. His mind was just now catching up. The girls' hopes, dreams, and possibilities were more important to him than his fears. Paul felt lighter than he had in days when he got up from the table. It was like a big weight had been taken off his shoulders. He knew it was the right thing to do, even though the road ahead would be hard and full of problems he couldn't even imagine. His steps were full of purpose and fresh energy as he grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. He had to go back to the school and adopt these girls as his own. He had to give them the family they deserved, and maybe even find the family he had always wanted. As Paul made his way to Margaret's office, his steps could be heard resonating through the orphanage's well-known halls. His heart was beating fast, but he was determined. As he told her about his choice, Margaret looked up from her desk, her kind eyes crinkling with understanding. "I want to take them in. That's all 4 of them," he said, his voice calm, even though he was scared. Margaret's face got softer. "I thought you would make this choice, Paul. But are you sure?" Paul took a deep breath and kept his eyes fixed on her. "I agree, Margaret. I can give them a home because they deserve it." Margaret leaned forward, and her face showed that she was feeling both safe and warm. "I know your heart, Paul, but raising 4 girls alone, especially considering the challenges they might face, isn't going to be easy." Paul gave her a nod, getting ready for what she might say next. "I know it's a lot of work," he said, his voice calm. "But they need someone to fight for them and see them for who they are. I want to be that person." Even more tears came into Margaret's eyes. "They'll need a lot of love, support, and patience, and there will be people who don't understand or approve." Before meeting her eyes again, Paul looked down for a moment, and then up with quiet purpose. "I know how they feel, Margaret. Like no one wants you, and you're not seen. I'm not going to let them feel that way as adults. Not while I still have power to stop it." Margaret smiled softly, and her eyes lit up with admiration. "Andy, you're a good person. You are the only one who can give them what they need. Remember, though, that they will test you. There may be times when you doubt this choice." After hours, when the first forms were filled out, Paul called the girls into the playroom. Sunlight came in through the windows and made warm spots on the old rugs where the toys were strewn around. 4 girls sat in a half circle in front of him. Their blue dresses were all the same, and were a little wrinkled from playing. Paul got down on his knees next to them and looked into their eager faces. His hands were slightly shaking. He began in a soft voice, "Girls, I need to ask you something very important." He took a big breath in. "Would you like to live with me? I'd like to be your dad." There was silence in the room for a moment. The girls looked at each other with big eyes, as if to make sure they understood. Then, slowly, their faces changed as happiness began to show. The little girl whispered, "Really?" Her voice was shaking with hope. "Really," Paul said, his own eyes getting wet. As soon as the girls saw him, they jumped at him and gave him a group hug that almost knocked him over. As they moved their few things into his flat, their pure and beautiful laughter filled the room. There were comments and looks from some of Paul's coworkers that he couldn't miss. Someone said, "He's wasting his life. 4 kids his age? He'll always owe money." Someone else shook their head and said, "Poor guy doesn't know what he's getting into." Every word hurt, but Paul forgot about the criticism when he saw his girls putting away their few toys in their new home, and seeing the joy on their faces. He could already see how his small room was changing. There were bright drawings on the fridge, laughter that could be heard through the walls, and 4 pairs of small shoes nicely stacked by the door. One of the girls put her little hand on his as they walked into their new home together. She asked, "Are you really our dad now?" She looked up at him with faith in her eyes. Paul gave her a light squeeze. "Yes, honey, I really am." When he got the girls to his small apartment and let them chatter happily, it made him feel good. But he was worried about bills, food, school supplies, and clothes. The list of costs seemed to go on forever and got longer every day. He took out his old leather wallet and, for the 3rd time that night, counted the few bills that were inside. The money he made as a social worker when he lived by himself was enough, but now he had to feed 5 people. The girls should have had a lot more than just making it. They should have had brand new clothes instead of used ones. new school supplies, and maybe even those art lessons they'd been wanting. He said to himself, maybe I could get some evening shifts at the grocery store or weekend work at the diner. He was writing numbers on a notepad. He quickly moved his pen as he compared how much they could earn to how much they needed. The numbers were dancing in front of his tired eyes as he tried to make them add up. He looked up when he heard the soft beat of little feet. All four girls stood in front of him with serious faces, and were still wearing the same used dress from the morning. "Daddy," one of them said, nervously twirling the bottom of her dress. "We saw you looking worried." "We can help," said someone else, her eyes shining with purpose. "Mrs. Peterson at the corner store said she needs someone to sweep her sidewalk. And we can deliver newspapers," the third girl excitedly added, rising to her feet. "Tommy from school does it, and he says it's easy," one of the girls said, with a serious tone, while nodding her head. It hurt Paul's heart to feel it so tight in his chest. Even though these sweet girls had already been through a lot, they were willing to work to help him out. He put down his paper and hugged them all with his arms spread wide. He breathed in the sweet smell of their shampoo. "Listen to me, my sweet girls," he said, touching each of their eyes with his own. "Right now, all you need to do is work hard in school and enjoy your childhood. I'm your dad now, and I'll take care of everything else. Moms and dads do that." But one of them began to argue, her lower lip shaking a little. "No buts," Paul said, in a soft but firm voice. "You pay attention to school and being a kid. I'll be most happy if I do that. Your great grades are the best help you can give me right now." He looked at their worried faces and smiled to reassure them, putting all of his love and confidence into that one look. "I promise everything will be okay. I'll make sure you have everything you need now that we're a family. People in a family help each other out like that." It was a tighter hug, and the girls' little arms went all the way around him. Paul held them close and promised in his mind that he would do anything to give them the chances they earned, even if it meant working all the extra hours he had. Weeks turned into years as time went on. Paul put his girls in a close school with some money he had saved. As Paul walked his girls to their first day of school, the morning sun cast long shadows on the brick front of the school. The girls wore plaid uniforms that matched, and their bags were almost as big as they were. He had carefully chosen new notebooks and pencils from the school supply list to put in them. It had a small charm on it that he had given them as a gift to calm them down. Paul asked them, as he bent down to fix their collars one last time, "Remember what we practiced?" He carefully smoothed out each pleat with his soft fingers. "Head up, smile bright, and be ourselves." They finished at the same time, laughing, as their matched braids moved back and forth with their nervous energy. As they got closer to the school entry, the noise of parents and kids seemed to stop all of a sudden. Paul did feel the weight of the looks and heard the whispers that were not so quiet. Is he really their dad? What kind of white man would adopt for black kids? A woman wearing designer sunglasses asked another mom as she slammed her coffee cup shut. "Such a shame," said another voice. "Taking on four at once. His life is going bad. That's too much for one man to handle." "Those poor girls," said someone else, with a sneer. "What kind of life can he give them? What they need will never be theirs." Paul's jaw clenched, but he kept a calm, friendly face for the sake of his girls. One of the girls was holding his hand tighter, and he could feel her little fingers shaking against his palm. Another daughter leaned in close to him. Inside the classroom, the teacher's smile looked fake as she put the quadruplets in different rows. Even though they were nervously looking at each other, other kids looked at her freely, and some even moved their desks a little, making little islands of silence around each girl. Paul whispered, "Girls," and pulled them close one last time before he had to leave. He could smell the clean shampoo they used in the shower that morning. "Remember what makes you unique. You're smart, nice, and have each other. You always have me, no matter what." Even though he could see doubt in their eyes, they bravely nodded. As they sat down, one by one, they pulled out their papers and began to work hard. Their small shoulders were squished together by the weight of the looks from their friends. As Paul walked back down the hallway, he heard more whispers and saw more critical looks. It hurt his heart to know that his girls would have to deal with these traits every day, but he felt proud at the same time. He had already seen how strong they were in the shelter when they tried to adopt but failed. Now here, they were survivors like him, with a strong will that went deep. When he got to the school's front door, he stopped and straightened his shoulders. Parental groups from the morning were still there, still looking and whispering. Some people quickly turned away when they saw him, but Paul kept his head held high. He knew that the 4 beautiful girls he now called his daughters were worth every sacrifice, struggle, and disapproving look. Any cost was worth it for their future. Very quickly, his days were filled with early starts and late ends. Paul worked 3 and sometimes 4 jobs to make sure the girls had clothes, food, and school. He worked part-time as a handyman on the weekends and put in hours at the nearby food store. At night, he cleaned office buildings. He was tired because he only got a few hours of sleep each night. But the girls' smiles and their bright futures kept him going. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Paul gave his daughters a stable life with all of his power. In the following 6 months, one of the girls ran up to him as he walked through the door after a late shift. "Dad," she yelled with joy, "you have to come to our parent-teacher meeting tomorrow." Paul's heart beat faster. Even though he was a little nervous, people had looked at him with interest and made decisions in their heads before. He would do anything for the girls. He got up the next morning after another night of not getting much sleep. He put on his one tie and a shirt that had just been ironed and went to school. When he got to the school's front door, he stopped and straightened his shoulders. The parents who had been there in the morning were still there, still looking and whispering. When he looked them in the eyes, some quickly turned away. Paul moved around in his small classroom chair, and he didn't feel like he belonged with the other parents. At the parent-teacher meeting, the room was full of quiet talks and looks that would sometimes catch his attention, making him feel like he was an animal in a zoo. He fussed with his worn-out tie, which was the only one he had, and smoothed out his brand-new shirt, which still had a faint smell of the cheap starch he had used that morning. "Did you hear?" asked a woman close, setting her expensive purse on her knee. He took all 4 of them in as his own. What did he think? Having one child is hard enough, but being a single dad to 4 girls? Someone else's parent shook her head. No, there's no way they could be getting good advice. Kids need to be touched by a mother. Paul's cheeks hurt, but he kept his eyes on the first teacher as she spoke. Mrs. Rose, who taught math, cleared her throat and repositioned her wire-rimmed glasses, which sparkled in the electric lights. "I'd like to talk about your girls' amazing progress," she said, her voice authoritative and friendly. "All 4 have shown that they are very good at math. Sarah, in particular, figured out a hard problem that even 6th graders have trouble with. She came up with a beautiful answer that even I thought was great." There were no more whispers. There was only careful silence. Instead, Paul felt proud, and for a moment, he forgot about how uncomfortable he had been earlier. While rising from his seat at the front of the room, Mr. Peters said, "Emma's creative writing stands out in my English class. For her age, her stories have a lot of meaning. Several of us were moved to tears by the beautiful piece she wrote about family last week." One by one, the teachers praised his daughter's perfect attendance. Even though it rained or had a cold, their willingness to help peers who were having trouble with lessons, and their constant politeness and determination in the face of problems. With each compliment, Paul sat up straighter, his confidence taking the place of his earlier nervousness. He forgot his tie and noticed how the room had changed. The angry looks had turned into looks of reluctant respect, and then real admiration. That parent who had been whispering earlier looked embarrassed. as she looked at her manicured hands in her lap and forgot her expensive purse. Rachel and Lucy's science project was great. Their teacher gushed, and her excitement spread to the other students. They put together a project about the sun and planets. We put up a poster of their talk in the hallway because it was so interesting. Their work lights were even added to show the orbital routes. Paul could hear different kinds of whispers in the air after the meeting was over. They need to work hard at home to study. Have you seen their work? Amazingly fine details. My son can't stop talking about it. Those girls will do great things. Something must be going right for him. The door to the classroom slammed open, and 4 excited faces, with red cheeks from running in, came in. "Daddy!" they all yelled at the same time, running toward him, with folders full of papers and big smiles on their faces. Paul pulled them close, and they held their accomplishments in their small hands. Their faces lit up with pride and love. At that moment, every doubtful statement, sacrifice, and extra shift he had worked at the social services office felt like it was all worth it. These girls were not only doing well, they were thriving. One day, Paul was on his way to work early in the morning. After sending the girls off at school, when he heard a voice he knew. "Richard, is that you, Paul Miller?" Jake Chen, his old college friend, was standing outside the corner cafe when he turned around. Jacob looked just like the pictures of him on social media. He wore a designer suit, a pricey watch, and had that smile that made you think he knew something other people didn't. His neatly styled hair hadn't changed since they were in college together. "Jacob, it's been years," Paul said, with a smile, as he shook hands with his old friend. That was a very different high five from the ones they used to give each other in their dorm room. "Come have coffee with me." With the same strong sense of responsibility he'd always had, Jacob insisted, "My treat." He led them to the door of the cafe. "I want to hear what you've been up to." As they sat down in a quiet table in the corner, steam rose from their cups. Jacob stirred his craft coffee, and Paul held his plain black coffee in his hands. People going to and from work in the morning filled the cafe, and their talks made a soft background. Jacob leaned back and adjusted his gold cufflinks. "So, fill me in," he said. "Still doing that social work thing?" Paul nodded, and then he started to tell the story of the 4 babies. His voice got warmer as he talked about the good things they had done at school lately. When he talked about their science fair project, his eyes lit up. His words were cut off by Jacob's sharp, rude laughing. "Wait, you actually adopted 4 kids by yourself?" He shook his head, and a smile came across his face. "Man, what are you getting into? You're missing out on a chance. We both know that you did really well in pre-med." Paul's coffee tasted bitter all of a sudden. He put more pressure on the clay mug with his fingers. "They needed a place to live, Jacob." "Look at me," Jacob said, pointing to his fancy suit and fixing his silk tie. "Now, I have my own tech consulting business, 3 vacation homes, and every freedom in the world." He pulled a business card from a sleek leather wallet and slid it across the table. "That could have been you too, you know. I need someone like you. What you're making now would triple when you start making money." Paul felt the card being heavy in his hand, and the raised letters caught the light of the morning. "I appreciate the offer, but..." Jacob spoke up while looking at his Rolex. "Stop trying to save everyone and start living for yourself. These kids aren't even yours. Why give up everything for them?" Paul's chest swelled, but he kept his speech calm. He stood up quietly and said, "I should get to work. It was good seeing you, Jacob." "The offer stands," Jacob called after him as Paul left, his half-drunk coffee behind, and walked out the door. As he walked out into the morning air, the bell above the door rang. Paul's steps felt heavier than normal as he walked to his office. Jacob's words kept playing over and over in his mind. He felt like the business card was burning in his pocket. Time moved slowly, like a river, taking Paul and his girls through times of growth and change. There were 4 young girls living in a small apartment that used to feel crowded. On the walls, their school diplomas and achievement ribbons looked like proud badges of their trip. There were science fair awards on the windowsills and college papers on every surface. Sarah, who was only a few minutes older than Paul, had taken on his quiet drive. Emma had the same quick wit as her sister. Lucy's logical mind and Rachel's caring personality made everyone think of their dad. They became a close-knit group that helped each other through everything, from studying late at night to personal problems. "Dad, what do you think?" One afternoon, Sarah smashed through the door with a letter in her hand, her face red with joy. "The Matthew Science Scholarship was given to me." Her sisters came after her, each holding a similar package. Their faces were beaming with pride. Andy stood up from his old couch and was very proud of himself. The award announcements were coming to their house more and more often, and each one made him feel better about money. His girl's determination made him think of when he was younger and had similar hopes and dreams. While they ate dinner at their small table, they often talked about Paul's past. "Tell us again about your time in medical school, Dad," Sarah would ask as she ate her soup. She was eager to learn more about her dad's life. Paul would talk about the times his hopes were cut short, but not with anger, but with hope. "I made it to my last year before the money ran out," he'd say, running his hand through his graying hair. "There is a reason for everything, though." When he smiled, it was always with the knowledge of acceptance. Emma spoke up one night as they cleaned the kitchen. "My dad and I have been talking." The other girls squished together and formed a circle around him. "Every one of us is going to become a doctor. We'll open the clinic you've always wanted." Paul stopped and took a dish towel out of his hand. He was moved by what they said. It made his heart swell with feeling. "Ladies, you don't need to." "We want to," Lucy said softly, putting her hand on his arm. "You quit your dream to make a way for us to live. We now want that dream to come true for everyone." All of her sisters agreed and nodded. Paul stood in the packed auditorium on graduation day and watched his girls walk across the stage one by one. The lights made their honor cords shine. His eyes filled with tears as he thought of those 4 little girls in blue dresses who were waiting by the door to the shelter. Now, they stood tall and sure of themselves. Their futures looked bright and promising, and they were determined to not give up. Paul never thought he'd see all 4 of his girls graduate from medical school with honors, but after years of hard work, he did. After the ceremony, all of the girls crowded around Paul. They were all very happy, and their faces were glowing with pride. They all had the same beautiful smile that he loved. Sarah grabbed his hand and said, "Dad, we need to tell you something. Various well-known hospitals in various cities have offered us jobs." Paul's heart beat faster as he got ready for them to leave. Emma quickly went on, though, and her voice was warm and comforting. She said, "But we're not taking them. We've chosen to stay here." Maria added, with her eyes sparkling with joy, "Do you remember that Oak Street building that was empty? It has already been looked at as a rental. It works great for what we want to do." Lucy took out a folder that was full of carefully written ideas. The pages were clear and nice to look at. "Dad, we're going to open our own family clinic. In this town where we live. The place where it all began. This has been in the works for months." Paul couldn't say a word as he looked at the detailed plans and business plans that his girls had made. While he turned the leaves, his hands were shaking a little. As he had always dreamed, the clinic would have sliding fees so that everyone, no matter how much money they had, could get medical care. "This was always your dream," Sarah told him softly, as she put her arm around his waist. "And now it's also ours. We want to give back to the community that raised us and gave you to us." Paul's eyes filled with tears as he watched his girls talk excitedly about their plans. Their excited sounds mixed together. No longer were these the scared little girls from the home. These doctors had grown into strong, caring adults who were determined to make a change in people's lives. They picked a small building that needed work, but had potential. As they walked through it together, sunlight came in through the dirty windows. Each girl already knew what field they would specialize in. Emma would do family medicine, Sarah would do internal medicine, and Lucy would do psychiatry. Their different skills would work together to make a full-service care center for the people in the community who had helped them for so long. Emma pointed to a large corner office and said, "Look, Dad." Her face lit up with excitement. "Take this one. You will be in charge of our office. We need your social work skills to help us get to the people who need us the most. Without you, we couldn't do this." Paul put his fingers on the wall of the building that would become their family clinic and traced the peeling paint that would soon be replaced. He was proud and thankful in his heart. His unfulfilled dream hadn't died. In the hearts of his daughters, it had grown into something much more beautiful than he could have dreamed. The new family center on Oak Street got a lot of attention very quickly. The waiting room used to be empty, but now it's full of people who want to see the quadruplets, because they are known for providing great care and kindness. Paul was friendly and quick at running the front desk, making everyone feel welcome. Children's art made by grateful patients was on the walls, and the bright, friendly room was filled with the soft hum of conversation. Someone they knew came through the door one wet morning. It was Jacob Chen, who had made fun of Paul for adopting the girls years before. He was drenched at the door, and instead of his expensive suit, he was wearing old clothes. The sure of himself he used to have had changed into a more humble attitude. The dark circles under his eyes showed that he had been worrying and not getting enough sleep. Jacob mumbled, I lost everything, trying to avoid Paul's eyes. The company failed. I can't afford to get normal medical care anymore. I've heard that this place helps poor people, though." He nervously played with the thread that was coming loose on the sleeve of his jacket. Paul kept his cool, even though the memory of that talk in the coffee shop years ago made his heart race. He gave Jacob the forms without saying anything, treating him like any other patient. They didn't say anything, but the clipboard felt heavy with words. Sarah left her office to call the next patient. She was dressed in a clean white coat and a stethoscope around her neck, like a professional. Her walk showed that she had studied and practiced hard for years. Jacob's jaw dropped when he saw her. His words were shaky. You're one of Paul's girls? Now you're a doctor?" Her smile was warm, and she looked like the real deal. "Yes. We are all four. Our father and I run this business together." The way she stressed the word father was soft but clear, and her voice was full of pride, just like the look in her eyes. He looked at Paul with a red face of shame. "I had the wrong idea about you, Paul. I could not have been more wrong when I said that you were wasting your life that day. Please take a look at what you and they have done. I'm sorry." He spoke with the weight of years of regret in his heart. Paul just nodded and took the apology with the same quiet respect he had shown years before. He said in a soft voice, "Sarah will take care of you. She is a great doctor." His soft smile didn't show any anger. It only showed happiness that his girls had done even better than he had hoped. The small practice, which began with only 5 exam rooms, quickly grew into something much bigger than Paul had ever thought possible. The town learned about the 4 smart doctor sisters and their kind father, who made sure that no patient was turned away for lack of money. They opened a second office across town in just 2 years. The girls took on each task with the same determination they'd shown since they were kids, even though they had to work longer hours and take on more duties. Patients from nearby places came to see them because they were known for being the best, and soon there were waiting lists for appointments. Paul stood in front of their newest project, a modern hospital that would serve the whole area. It had been 5 years since they opened their first clinic. The building sparkled in the early morning sun, and the sky could be seen through its windows. Miller Family Hospital was written in big letters at the front door to honor the name he gave his girls. Paul's eyes filled with tears as he watched his girls cut the ribbon at the big opening. Each of them had become an expert in a different area of medicine, making the hospital able to treat everyone from babies to old people. Just like Paul had always dreamed, the hospital would treat everyone who needed it, even if they couldn't pay. Paul thought about how life had come full circle as he stood in his office one night and looked at pictures of his journey with the girls. From when they were little girls in blue dresses at the home to when they graduated from medical school. Every hard time he had as a child, every judgment he faced, and every commitment he made had led to this point. He got a loving family and realized his childhood dream of helping people through medicine. Because he chose to help others instead of trying to get rich. He was there with memories all around him when his girls found him and gave him a big hug. They always said, "Thank you, Dad," together, even when they were older. Paul smiled because he knew that the best things in life happen when you give instead of take, when you love instead of judge, and when you believe in other people when no one else did. If you enjoyed the story of Paul, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.